Ah, welcome back. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Today, we are going to a place that is very old and very cold. We are going to Scotland. But not the Scotland of castles and guys in kilts playing bagpipes on a sunny hill. We are going way further north than that. We are going to the Orkney Islands. If you look at a map of the United Kingdom, Orkney is that little scatter of islands floating off the top right edge, looking like it's trying to escape into the Arctic. It is a beautiful place. It's green, it's wild, and it has a lot of sheep. But mostly it has wind. I don't mean a gentle breeze that messes up your hair. I mean wind that feels like it has a personal vendetta against you. Wind that you can lean against. In Orkney, the trees don't really grow up. They just sort of cower near the ground, hoping the wind doesn't notice them. And that is where our story begins. Not with a king, or a war, or a piece of gold. It begins with the weather. It is the winter of 1850. Now, winter in 1850 was not fun. They didn't have Netflix. They didn't have central heating. They had wool socks and fire. And in Orkney, in the winter, the sun barely bothers to show up. It comes up for a few hours, looks around at the gray ocean, decides it's too cold, and goes back down again. So picture this scene. It's December. The locals are hunkered down in their cottages. These people are tough. They are farmers and fishermen. They are used to bad weather. A bad storm to us is just a Tuesday for them. But the storm that rolled in off the Atlantic Ocean in 1850 was different. This was a monster. It hit the Bay of Skyle on the west coast of the main island. The Bay of Skyle is a wide, curved beach. Today, it's a lovely place to walk your dog, provided your dog doesn't mind getting sand blasted into its nostrils. But on this night, the bay was a war zone. The wind wasn't just howling, it was screaming. It was the kind of storm that makes the house shake. You know that feeling? When you're lying in bed and the window rattles in its frame, and you think, I really hope the roof is attached as well as I think it is. Now imagine that, but you're living in a stone cottage in 1850, and the ocean is only a few hundred yards away. The waves were massive. We were talking about walls of black water, crashing down with enough force to rearrange the coastline. The spray from the sea was being whipped up and thrown inland, so the air wasn't just air anymore. It was a mix of salt, water, and sand. For the people living there was nothing to do but wait. You just sat by the fire, listened to the world ending outside, and drank tea. Or maybe something stronger than tea. Probably something stronger. This storm went on for a long time. It pounded the coast. It scoured the earth. And specifically, it attacked a large, grassy hill that sat right next to the beach. This hill had been there forever. It was just a big mound of sand covered in grass. The locals called it Skara Brae. They didn't think much about it. It was just a bump. A place where rabbits lived. A place to sit and watch the waves on a nice day. It was part of the furniture of the landscape. But the wind that night was hungry. It didn't just blow over the hill. It tore into it. It ripped the grass off the top like you'd peel the skin off an orange. Then, it started eating away at the sand underneath. Layer by layer, the storm stripped the hill naked. Thousands of tons of sand were picked up and thrown into the sky, carried away by the gale. It was a violent act of nature. If you had been standing there, which you wouldn't be, because you'd be dead, you would have seen the hill literally dissolving in front of your eyes. Finally, the storm passed. The wind died down. The ocean settled back into its usual grumpy, choppy rhythm. The sun came up, pale and watery, and then came the silence. That is the thing about big storms. The silence afterwards feels heavy. It rings in your ears. The villagers opened their doors. They probably stepped out cautiously, checking if their chimneys were still standing, checking if their sheep had been blown into Norway. They walked down toward the beach to see what the ocean had washed up. Usually, you find driftwood. Maybe some seaweed. Maybe, if you're lucky, a crate from a shipwreck with something useful inside. But on this morning, in the winter of 1850, they didn't look at the beach. They looked at the hill. The grassy mound was gone. Or rather, the skin of it was gone. The storm had bitten a massive chunk out of the coastline. And there, sticking out of the raw, exposed sand, were bones. Not human bones. Not exactly. They were stone bones. The villagers walked closer. Their boots crunched on the fresh debris. They must have been confused. They knew this land. They knew every rock, every dip, every fence post. This hill had always been just a hill. But now they could see walls. Jagged, gray slabs of stone were poking out of the earth. And they weren't just random rocks piled up by nature. Nature doesn't build straight lines. Nature doesn't stack flat stones one on top of the other with perfect precision. This was something man-made. They got closer. They saw that these walls formed a shape. It looked like a room. But it was a room without a roof, filled with sand and rubble. Imagine the feeling of seeing that. It's not like finding a coin on the sidewalk. It's like finding a house in your attic that you didn't know was there. The locals stood there in the cold morning air, looking at this impossible structure. It looked ancient. It didn't look like the cottages they lived in. It looked like something from a different world. They were looking at the top of a house, but they didn't know it yet. One of them, maybe a brave one, or maybe just a bored one, might have climbed up the dune to look down into it. Inside the stone outline, half buried in the drift, they could see things. Weird shapes. A stone box. A pile of rubble that looked like a seat. It was a ghost town, and the storm had just opened the door. They had no idea that they were standing on top of one of the most important discoveries in human history. They were just cold, wet, and confused. They didn't know that this pile of rocks was older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. They didn't know it was older than Stonehenge. They just knew that the storm had stolen their hill and left something strange in its place. The wind whistled through the cracks in the new stones. It was a lonely sound. The villagers probably looked at each other, scratched their heads, and thought, well, the laird is going to want to see this. And that is where the real digging begins. Because the storm had done the hard work. It had peeled back the curtain of time. Now, it was up to the people to see what was hiding in the dark. But that is for the next chapter. Good night. So, the storm has passed. The wind has stopped screaming. And the villagers are standing on the beach, staring at these strange stone walls sticking out of the sand. Now, usually when something weird happens in a small village in the 1850s, people might ignore it. They have sheep to feed. They have cows to milk. They have very serious beards to groom. Life is busy. But luckily for history, the man who owned the land was not just a farmer. He was the laird. Meet William What. William What was the laird of Skyle. Now, laird is just a fancy Scottish word for the guy who owns the big house in the land. He lived in Skyle House, a beautiful mansion just a short walk from where the storm hit. William wasn't an archaeologist. In 1850, archaeology wasn't really the science it is today. Today, archaeology involves toothbrushes, laser scanners, and people yelling at you if you touch anything. Back then, archaeology was basically just rich guys with shovels looking for cool stuff to put on their mantelpiece. It was a hobby, like golf, but with more dirt. When William What saw the ruins exposed by the storm, he didn't call the university. He didn't call the government. He probably just looked at his boots, looked at the hill, and thought, I'm going to need a bigger shovel. His curiosity got the better of him. He gathered a few locals, maybe his workers, maybe just some guys who wanted to see what was happening, and they started to dig. This is where the story gets really interesting. Because this wasn't a careful excavation. They were clearing tons of sand. It was heavy back-breaking work. Imagine the sound. Crunch, scrape, toss. The sand had been packed tight for thousands of years. It was wet and heavy, but as they peeled it away, the shape of the stones became clearer. They weren't just random walls. They were curves. They were rooms. William What must have felt his heart beating a little faster. You have to remember, he didn't know what he was looking for. Was it a Viking fort? Was it a tomb? Was it a secret hideout for smugglers? He kept digging, and then they broke through. They cleared enough sand to step inside one of the structures. Let's pause here for a second. I want you to really try and imagine this moment. For 5,000 years, this room had been dark, completely black. The last time light had touched these floor stones, the Great Pyramids in Egypt hadn't been built yet. Mammoths were gone, but only just. The world was a completely different place. And now, suddenly, a Victorian gentleman in a tweed suit is standing there, blocking the sun. The air inside must have been strange. You know that smell when you open a cupboard that hasn't been opened in years? It's dusty. It's stale. It smells like time itself. Now multiply that by 50 centuries. William Wood stepped inside. His boots probably echoed on the stone floor. He looked around, and what he saw didn't make sense. If this was a tomb, where were the bodies? If this was a fort, where were the weapons? It wasn't a tomb, and it wasn't a fort. It was a living room. As his eyes adjusted to the shadows, he saw something that changed our understanding of history forever. Against the back wall, standing there as casual as you please, was a dresser. A stone dresser. It looks exactly like something you might have in your kitchen right now to hold your plates. It had shelves. It had legs. It was built perfectly out of flat slabs of rock. This was the moment the penny dropped. Ancient people, the cavemen we usually think of, weren't supposed to have furniture. They were supposed to be wild. They were supposed to be running around hitting things with clubs and sleeping in piles of leaves. But here was a dresser. A place to put your special things. A place to show off your best pottery. It was so human. It was so domestic. William Wood stared at it. It was still standing exactly where someone had left it. It wasn't broken. It wasn't knocked over. It was just waiting. He looked down. In the center of the room, there was a square box made of stones. It was full of ash, a hearth, a fireplace. This is where the family sat. This is where they cooked their dinner. This is where they warmed their feet after a long day of fishing in the North Sea. Suddenly, these weren't mysterious ancient aliens. They were people. Just like William. Just like you and me. They like to be warm. They like to have shelves for their stuff. The realization must have been spooky. It wasn't like finding a ruin that had been destroyed by a war. When a castle is destroyed, the walls are smashed. There are scorch marks. It feels like a violent end. But Skara Brae wasn't like that. It felt paused. It felt like the people had just stepped out for a minute. Maybe they went to get milk. Maybe they went to check the weather. It felt like they might come back at any moment and ask William why he was standing in their living room with a shovel. The dust was undisturbed. Small artifacts were lying on the floor. Beads, bits of bone. William Wood collected dozens of items. He was obsessed. He spent the next few years digging up 4 of these houses. He found more dressers. He found beds, actual stone frames where people slept. He didn't find any gold. He didn't find any jewels. To the outside world, it might have seemed boring. Oh, look, some old rocks. But to William, and to anyone with an imagination, it was magic. He had found a time capsule. But here is the funny thing about amateur archaeology. William didn't really know what to do with it. He displayed the artifacts in his house. He invited his friends over to look at the old village. It became a local curiosity. He didn't know how old it was. He thought it might be from the Iron Age, maybe 1,000 years old or so. He had no way of knowing he was off by about 4,000 years. Carbon dating hadn't been invented yet, so he was looking at something from the Stone Age, thinking it was much newer. It's like finding a dinosaur bone and thinking it belongs to a really big cow. You are impressed, but you are missing the main point. Eventually, the excitement faded a bit. The sand, which is the real villain of this story, started to blow back in. The site was left alone again. William Wood got older. The shovel was put away. For a while, Skara Brae went back to sleep. It had been woken up, poked at, and then left to doze off again under the Orkney sky. But the secret was out. The sand couldn't hide it forever. The world now knew that under the grass of the Bay of Skara, there was a ghost town. A town with beds and fireplaces and shelves. And soon, the real scientists were going to come. And they were going to ask the big question. Who were these people? And where did they go? But before we get to the people, we need to understand the world they lived in. We need to go back. Way, way back. Before the shovel. Before the storm. Before the laird. We need to go back to a time when the pyramids were just a twinkle in a pharaoh's eye. That is chapter 3. Good night. So we have the storm. We have the laird with his shovel. And we have these amazing stone houses sitting open to the sky. As news of this discovery started to spread, slowly, because remember, News traveled by horse and boat back then. People started to give Skara Brae a nickname. They called it the Scottish Pompeii. Now, that is a very cool nickname. It sounds dramatic. It sounds expensive. It sounds like something you put on a movie poster with big, exploding letters. You probably know the story of the real Pompeii. In ancient Rome, a volcano called Vesuvius blew its top. It was a massive tragedy. Ash fell from the sky like snow, but hot. It buried the city so fast that people were frozen in time. They were found huddled together. Bread was found still in the ovens. It was a snapshot of a single, terrifying moment. When early historians looked at Skara Brae, they wanted it to be just like that. Humans love a good drama. We are addicted to it. We don't want to hear about a village that just sort of closed down. We want chaos. We want a climax. So the early theory about Skara Brae was the sudden disaster theory. The idea went like this. The villagers were living their happy, Neolithic lives. They were cooking fish. They were polishing their beads. They were chatting about the weather. And then boom, or rather whoosh. The theory was that a massive sandstorm, much bigger than the one in 1850, hit the village without warning. I want you to try and imagine that for a second. This is the scary part of the bedtime story. Imagine you are standing in one of those stone houses. It's nighttime. You have a small fire burning in the center of the room. It's warm. It's safe. The stone walls are thick. But outside, the wind changes tone. It stops whistling and starts roaring. It sounds like a freight train is parking on your roof. Then the sand starts to come in. Not just a little dust. We are talking about the sky falling down. It blasts through the low doorway. It pours down through the smoke hole in the roof. It's not water. You can't swim in it. It's heavy, gritty, suffocating sand. It fills the room in minutes. The theory said that the villagers panicked. They dropped everything. They ran. They grabbed their children and scrambled out of the tunnels, clawing their way up to the surface, gasping for air, leaving their entire lives behind them to be buried forever. It is a terrifying image. It makes your heart race a little bit, doesn't it? There is actually some evidence that people used to support this idea. When they excavated the site, they found a famous necklace. It was made of bone beads, and it was lying right there on the floor near the doorway. The storyteller said, "Look at this. A woman was running for her life. The necklace snapped as she squeezed through the narrow door, and she didn't even stop to pick it up because the sand was chasing her." They also pointed to the limpet boxes, those stone tanks in the floor I mentioned earlier. They were still full of shells. "Look," they said. Dinner was halfway prepared. They left mid-meal. Just like Pompeii. It's a great story. It really is. It paints the people of Skara Brae as tragic victims of nature's fury. But there is a problem. Actually, there are a few problems. As modern archaeologists looked closer, the Scottish Pompeii theory started to fall apart. It started to look less like a blockbuster movie and more like, well, real life. Here is the buzzkill. If a sudden disaster hits a town, like a volcano, or an earthquake, or a mega sandstorm, you expect to find bodies. You expect to find the people who didn't make it out. The old, the sick, the slow. In the real Pompeii, they found hundreds of bodies. In Skara Brae, 0. Not a single skeleton was found inside the houses. No bodies huddled in corners. No hands reaching for the door. The houses were empty of people. That's clue number 1. Clue number 2 is what was left behind. Yes, there were some beads. Yes, there were some pots. And yes, there were the big stone dressers. But think about it. If you have to run for your life right now, what do you leave behind? You leave the heavy stuff. You leave the fridge. You leave the sofa. You leave the big stone dresser because you can't carry a 2-ton rock while you're running away. But what do you take? You take your best tools. You take your warm furs. You take your food. You take the things you need to survive. Skara Brae was actually quite clean. It wasn't messy. It didn't look like a place where people had been running around screaming. It looked like a place that had been packed up. The famous necklace that was dropped in panic, it was probably just lost. Maybe the string broke a week before they left. Maybe a kid dropped it. Losing jewelry isn't exactly a sign of the apocalypse. If archaeologists dug up my house in 1,000 years and found a lost earring under the sofa, they shouldn't assume I fled in terror. They should just assume I'm messy. So, if it wasn't a sudden disaster, what was it? The modern theory is actually much more interesting, in a quiet way. It's the theory of slow abandonment. It wasn't an explosion. It was a drift. Imagine a town where the economy goes bad. Or maybe the weather just gets slightly worse year after year. The sand dunes start creeping closer. The crops don't grow as well. The salt spray gets annoying. One family decides, you know what? This isn't great. Let's move inland. So they pack up. They take their nice furs. They take their best axe. They take the smoked ham hanging from the ceiling. They clean up the house, maybe leave a few broken pots behind, and they walk away. Then the house next door gets empty. Then the next one. It's a gradual decline. The older generation might have stayed. I was born in this stone box, and I'm going to die in this stone box. But the kids, they left. Eventually, the last fire went out. The last door was blocked up. And that is when the sand moved in. It wasn't a violent wave of sand that killed everyone. It was a slow, gentle burial. The wind blew sand into the empty doorways. The roof eventually collapsed. The grass grew over the top. The village wasn't murdered. It just retired. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's boring. I wanted the disaster. But I think the slow abandonment is actually more haunting. Think about the last person to leave Skara Brae. Imagine walking out of your house for the final time. You look at the stone dresser your grandfather built. You look at the hearth where you cooked 1,000 meals. You know you are never coming back. You don't run. You walk. You close the door. And you leave it to the silence. That is a heavy feeling. It's the feeling of an era ending. So while the Scottish Pompeii is a catchy name, it's not quite right. Pompeii was a tragedy of death. Skara Brae is a mystery of life. The people survived. They just moved on. But because they moved on, and because the sand covered their tracks so gently, they left us the most perfect, pristine picture of their world. They left us the shell of their lives. And now that we know they weren't running for their lives, we can calm down and really look at what they built. We can look at the architecture. Because let me tell you, these guys were not just piling rocks up. They were master builders. They were creating a world that was older than the pyramids, but comfier than a lot of modern apartments. So pull the covers up. We are going to step inside the house. We are going to look at the walls. In the next chapter, we enter a world before the pyramids. Welcome back. We have talked about the storm that uncovered the village. We have talked about the laird who dug it up. And we have busted the myth that everyone died in a disaster. Now, we need to talk about time. Time is a funny thing. When we look back at history, everything tends to get smushed together. We think of the past as one big, blurry lump. We imagine Romans having lunch with Vikings and knights fighting Egyptians. It all just feels like old stuff. But tonight, I want to untangle that knot. I want to take you back to a specific moment. I want you to close your eyes. Well, don't close them if you're watching the video, but you know what I mean. I want you to reset your internal clock. We are going back to the year 3100 BC. That is roughly when Skara Brae was built. Now, 3100 BC is just a number. It doesn't mean much on its own. So let's put some markers down to help us understand just how insanely old this place is. When we think of ancient history, what is the first thing that pops into your head? Probably the Great Pyramids of Giza. They are the ultimate symbol of old. They are massive. They are timeless. They are the postcards of antiquity. But here is the truth that might keep you awake for a minute. When the first stone was laid at Skara Brae, the Great Pyramids didn't exist. They wouldn't exist for another 500 or 600 years. If a person from Skara Brae could somehow travel forward in time to see the pyramids being built, they would look at them and say, wow, look at this futuristic technology. That is how old Skara Brae is. It is older than the pyramids. Let's try another one. Stonehenge. Stonehenge is the most famous pile of rocks in Britain. Everyone knows it. It's mysterious. It's grand. But compared to Skara Brae, Stonehenge is the new kid on the block. The people of Skara Brae had already lived there, raised their families, grown old, and abandoned their village long before the big stones of Stonehenge were ever set up. Skara Brae was already a ruin when Stonehenge was just getting started. This village predates almost everything we consider civilization. It predates the Great Wall of China. It predates the Mayan temples. It predates the Roman Empire by 3,000 years. If the Roman Empire is chapter 10 in a history book, Skara Brae is the prologue. So let's try to visualize this world. What did the Earth look like in 3100 BC? If you had a drone in 3100 BC and you flew it across Europe, you wouldn't see much. You wouldn't see London. You wouldn't see Paris. You wouldn't see Berlin. You would see trees. Endless, deep, dark forests. A massive canopy of green stretching from the coast of France all the way to Russia. Wolves roamed these forests. Bears. The rivers ran clear and clean because there were no factories to pollute them. The air was pure. There were no roads. There were just thin, muddy tracks made by deer and maybe a few brave travelers. Humanity was there, of course. We were around. But we were scattered. We were living in small groups, mostly in wooden huts that have long since rotted away. We were scratching out a living, hunting in the woods, farming small patches of dirt. And then there was Orkney. Orkney is way up north. It is an archipelago of islands off the top of Scotland. It is windswept. It is treeless. It is exposed. And for some reason, on this tiny, cold rock at the edge of the known world, a group of people decided to build a masterpiece. Think about the isolation. Today, if you run out of milk, you go to the store. If you are lonely, you call a friend. If you want to know what's happening in the world, you check your phone. But for the people of Skara Brae, there was no world. There was just the island. To the south, across the dangerous water, was the mainland of Scotland, a wild, mountainous place. To the west, nothing. Just the endless, gray Atlantic Ocean stretching out for thousands of miles. They had no idea that America existed. To them, the ocean just went on forever until it fell off the edge of the universe. They were living on the edge of the map. And yet, in this isolation, they didn't just survive. They thrived. They weren't huddled in caves shivering. They were building a society. They had a community. They had rules. They had fashion. They had furniture. It makes you wonder, why there? Why, in a world that was mostly empty wilderness, did civilization bloom on a windy beach in the North Sea? Maybe it was because the land was good for farming. Maybe it was because the sea was full of fish. Or maybe they just liked the view. But there is something very humbling about thinking of these people. Imagine standing on the beach at Skara Brae in 3000 BC. It is night. The fire is burning in your hearth behind you. You step outside to look at the sky. The stars are incredibly bright because there is no light pollution for thousands of miles. You look up at the Milky Way. You hear the waves crashing. You feel like you are the only person on Earth. And in a way, you are. You are part of a tiny bubble of light in a massive world of darkness. You don't know that thousands of miles away in the Middle East, people in Sumer are just starting to invent writing. You don't know that in Egypt, kings are starting to unite the land. You just know that your sheep are safe. Your house is warm. And your neighbor is cooking shellfish next door. That was their entire universe. And the most amazing part, they built their universe out of the only thing they had plenty of: stone. In most of Europe, people built with wood. Wood rots. Wood burns. Wood disappears. That is why we know so little about most Neolithic people. Their houses turn into compost thousands of years ago. But in Orkney, there are no trees. The wind sees to that. So they use the flat, gray slabs of sandstone that lay on the beach. And because they use stone, their world froze in time. It is a lucky accident of geology. Because they lacked timber, they became immortal. So when we walk into Skara Brae today, we aren't just looking at ruins. We are walking into a home from the dawn of time. We are touching the same walls that someone leaned against 5,000 years ago while they waited for the kettle to boil, or whatever the Neolithic equivalent of a kettle was. We are connecting with the ghosts of the deep past. And now that we know when we are, and where we are, it is time to look at what they built. Because the design of this village is genius. It wasn't just a bunch of houses sitting on the grass. It was a complex machine for living. It was designed to fight the wind, to trap the heat, and to keep the community together. To understand it, we have to go down. We have to go underground. In the next chapter, we are going to descend into the earth. We are going to look at how they buried themselves alive on purpose to survive the winter. Pull your blanket up. It's about to get cozy. Welcome back to the shelter. In the last chapter, we talked about how old this place is. We established that we are way back in the deep past, before the pyramids, living on the edge of the world. Now, we need to talk about the weather again. I know I keep bringing up the weather, but in Orkney, the weather isn't just small talk. It is the boss. It decides everything. If you have ever stood on a cliff in Scotland in November, you know what I mean? The cold doesn't just sit on your skin. It hunts you. It finds the gaps in your coat. It sneaks down your collar. It makes your bones ache. And the wind is a bully. If you try to build a tall wooden tower in Orkney, the wind will laugh at you, and then it will knock it down. So the people of Skara Brae had a problem. They wanted to settle down. They wanted to be warm. But they didn't have fiberglass insulation. They didn't have radiators. They didn't have double-glazed windows. They had stones. And stones, while very strong, are also very cold. If you build a house out of thin stone slabs standing up in the wind, it's basically like living in a refrigerator. The wind whistles right through the cracks. So, they came up with a brilliant solution. A solution that is used by rabbits, badgers, and hobbits. They didn't build up. They built down. Skara Brae is a subterranean village. It is a sunken city. When you visit today, you look down into the houses. But back then, it would have been even more extreme. From the outside, the village probably didn't look like a village at all. It would have looked like a gentle, grassy green hill with some smoke drifting out of the top. To enter your house, you wouldn't walk up some stairs. You would slip down into the earth. But here is the really clever part. They didn't just dig a hole in the dirt. Dirt is okay, but it can be damp. It can be unstable. Instead, they built their houses into something called midden. Now, midden is a polite archaeological word for, well, trash. But don't be grossed out. It wasn't like modern trash with plastic wrappers and old batteries. Neolithic trash was organic. It was ash from the fires. It was shells from the millions of limpets and oysters they ate. It was old animal bones. It was broken pottery. It was straw. Over hundreds of years, this mixture piles up. And when it gets wet and packed down, it turns into a thick, clay-like substance. It becomes hard, but it also has tiny air pockets in it. And if you know anything about building, you know that air pockets are the secret to insulation. This midden was the Neolithic equivalent of styrofoam. The people of Skara Brae basically surrounded their stone houses with a thick, warm blanket of compost. They packed it tight against the outside of the stone walls. This did two amazing things. First, it stopped the drafts. The wind could howl all it wanted, but it couldn't get through 6 feet of packed earth and shell. Second, it stabilized the temperature. The earth is a great moderator. In the summer, it keeps things cool. In the winter, it holds the heat. So imagine the engineering here. You build a stone shell. You bury it in warm, packed earth. You put a roof over the top. You have just created a thermos. Let's try to simulate the feeling of walking into one of these houses. This is the sensory part, so use your imagination. Imagine you are outside. It is the middle of winter. The sun has already gone down, even though it's only 3 p.m. It is pitch black. The wind is screaming off the ocean, carrying freezing rain that stings your face. You are wrapped in furs, but you are shivering. Your fingers are numb. You approach the village. You see a low, dark opening in the ground. You crouch down. You have to crouch because the doors are small, designed to keep the weather out. You step into the passageway. Immediately, the wind stops. It's like someone hit the mute button on the world. The roaring gale turns into a distant, dull thrumming sound, vibrating through the ground but not touching you. You crawl through the short tunnel. The stone is smooth under your hand. Then you turn the corner and enter the main room. The first thing that hits you is the warmth. It's not a scorching heat, but a thick, heavy, cozy warmth. The air is still. It smells of peat smoke, a rich, earthy smell, like burning wood and soil. It smells of dried fish and leather. It smells like safety. Because the house is sunk into the earth, the ground itself is hugging you. You are protected on all sides. The temperature difference would be shocking. Outside, it might be freezing, literally 0 degrees. Inside, with a central fire burning and the body heat of your family, it could be a comfortable 60 or 70 degrees. That creates a psychological feeling that is very powerful. Think about when you are in bed during a thunderstorm. The louder the thunder is outside, the safer you feel under your duvet. It's the contrast that makes it cozy. That was life in Skara Brae. The worse the weather got, the better it felt to be inside. This architecture changed how they lived. It meant they were very close to their neighbors. The houses weren't separate little islands. They were all connected by these tunnels, all buried in the same mound. If you needed to borrow a cup of sugar or a cup of barley, you didn't have to go outside. You could just crawl through the tunnel to house number 7. You could visit your grandmother without ever seeing the sky. It made the village feel like one big organism. One big, sleeping animal curled up against the cold. It also meant that the village was constantly changing. The midden kept growing. As they ate more shellfish and had more fires, the pile got higher. They were literally living inside the history of their own lives. They were insulated by the leftovers of their ancestors. There is something poetic about that. They were held warm by the past. But this subterranean life also had its quirks. It was dark, very dark. We will talk about the fire later, but without windows, the only light came from the roof and the hearth. It was a world of shadows, and it was quiet. Earth absorbs sound. If you shouted in one house, the neighbors probably wouldn't hear you through the thick midden walls. It was a private, muffled world. So when we look at the ruins today, stripped of their roof and stripped of some of that midden, we have to use our brains to put it back. Don't see it as a cold, open pit. See it as a burrow, a womb of stone and earth. It was a place where you could sleep deeply, knowing that no matter how angry the North Sea got, it couldn't touch you. The builders of Skara Brae weren't primitive cavemen hiding in holes. They were master architects who understood their environment perfectly. They knew that to survive the storm, you don't fight it. You hide from it. You let the wind blow over you. And now that we are inside, safe from the cold, let's take a look around. Because the inside of these houses, well, it's surprisingly modern. In the next chapter, we are going to take a tour of the most famous house in the village. House number 1. We are going to look at the furniture. We are going to look at the beds. And we're going to see exactly how they spent their evenings. So stay warm. We're going deeper. Welcome inside. You have crawled through the low tunnel. You have escaped the wind. And now you can stand up. We are standing in the middle of house number 1. This is the most famous house in Skara Brae. It is the one you see on all the postcards. It is the one that makes archaeologists scratch their heads and smile. Why? Because it feels so familiar. If you walked into a Roman ruin or a Greek temple, it feels grand, but it feels distant. It feels like a public building. But this feels like a living room. The room is roughly square, about 40 square meters. That is a decent size. It's bigger than a lot of studio apartments in New York or London. But the corners aren't sharp. They are rounded. Everything here is soft, curved, and organic. Let's take a slow tour. I want you to look around the room with me. The first thing you notice, the absolute first thing, is what is standing against the back wall, directly opposite the door. It is the dresser. I have mentioned this before, but we need to really look at it now. This is the superstar of Skara Brae. It is a shelving unit built entirely out of flat slabs of stone. It has 2 shelves. It has little legs, keeping it off the floor. Now stop and think about why this is here. In a survival situation, you build things you need. You build a roof to keep dry. You build a fire to keep warm. You build a bed to sleep. You do not need a dresser. A dresser doesn't keep you alive. A dresser is for showing off. This is a status symbol. It is placed directly across from the door so that the moment a neighbor crawls in, the first thing they see is your stuff. Oh, hello. Welcome to my cave. Please admire my beautiful collection of grooved ware pottery on the top shelf. And look, I have a whalebone necklace on the bottom shelf. No big deal. It tells us that these people weren't just surviving. They were social. They had pride. They had a sense of style. They liked to display their treasures just like we display family photos or trophies today. It makes them feel incredibly human. It's the Neolithic version of a flat-screen TV on the wall. It's the focal point of the room. Now, turn your head to the right. See that stone box on the floor, built against the wall? That is the bed. But don't panic. They didn't sleep directly on the cold rock. That would be terrible for your back and even worse for your temperature. This is a box bed. It's a frame. Inside that stone rectangle, they would have piled up softness. We know from the pollen found in the dirt that they used heather, a purple flowering plant that grows all over the Scottish moors. Have you ever touched heather? It's springy. If you pile enough of it up, it acts like a mattress. It smells nice too. It has a sweet, earthy scent. On top of the heather, they would lay sheepskins, thick, woolly furs. So imagine sinking into that. You have a foot of springy heather underneath you. You have warm furs wrapped around you. You are off the cold floor. It actually sounds pretty comfortable, doesn't it? But here is a weird detail that archaeologists noticed. In almost every house in Skara Brae, the bed on the right side of the room is bigger, and the bed on the left side is smaller. Why? The leading theory is that this was a gender thing. The men slept on the right, and the women slept on the left. Now, before you get mad, it wasn't necessarily because the men were more important. It might just be that the men were physically taller on average, so they got the longer bed. Or maybe it was cultural. In many ancient societies, and even some modern ones, there is a male side and a female side of the house. The bed on the right, the male bed, is usually about 6 feet long. The bed on the left, the female bed, is usually shorter, maybe 5 feet. But wait, there's more. Look closely at the stone pillars next to the beds. Some of them have little holes drilled into them. Why would you drill a hole in your bedpost? To hang a canopy. They probably draped furs or leather skins over the bed to create a little tent. This is genius. Remember, there are no bedrooms here. It's one big room. The parents are here. The kids are here. Maybe the aunt is visiting. If you want some privacy for sleeping or for making more babies, you need a curtain. By hanging a canopy over the bed, you create a room within a room. It traps your body heat even more, making it toasty warm inside your little fur tent. So picture the scene at night. The central fire is dying down to glowing red embers. The room is shadowy. You can hear the breathing of your family. You climb into your box bed, pull the fur curtain closed, and curl up in the heather. It is the ultimate cozy nest. Now look at the floor. In the corners of the room, you might see small waterproof stone boxes sunk into the ground. These are the limpet tanks I mentioned. They were sealed with clay to make them watertight. These were probably their version of a refrigerator. They could fill them with water and keep shellfish alive in there until they were ready to eat them. Fresh seafood on demand, right in your living room. Or maybe they were for soaking limpet shells to make bait. Either way, it shows that the house was a workshop, a kitchen, and a bedroom all in one. There is one more thing in house number 1 that I love. Near the door, there is a small cell built into the wall. It has a drain leading out of the house. What is it? Some people say it's a toilet. An indoor toilet. If that's true, these guys were more advanced than Londoners in the 1800s. But others think it was just a drain for washing things, or slumping out the bloody water after butchering a seal. Whatever it was, it shows they cared about hygiene. They weren't living in filth. They had systems to move waste out of the house. Standing in house number 1, you get a feeling of order. Everything has a place. The dresser is for looking at. The beds are for sleeping. The hearth is for cooking. The tanks are for storage. It isn't chaos. It is a home. You can imagine the rules they must have had. Wipe your feet before you come in. Don't put your muddy boots on the stone dresser. Stop poking the fire. It connects us to them across 5,000 years. We might use iPhones and they use stone axes, but we both like a comfortable bed, a warm fire, and a nice shelf to put our trophies on. We both want to feel safe when the wind blows. But house number 1 is just one example. The village is full of these homes, and connecting them is a network of tunnels that feels like something out of a fantasy novel. In the next chapter, we are going to crawl back out into those passageways. We are going to explore the dark, cramped tunnels that turn this village into a maze. So stretch your legs. We have to crouch down again. Welcome back. We have spent some time getting cozy in house number 1. We sat by the fire, we looked at the dresser, and we tested out the heather mattress. It was nice, wasn't it? But now it is time to leave. If you lived in Skara Brae, leaving your house didn't mean stepping outside. It didn't mean opening a door and getting blasted by the rain. It meant stepping into the street. But the streets of Skara Brae aren't like the streets you and I know. There is no pavement. There are no streetlights. And you definitely can't drive a car down them. You can barely even walk down them. The village is connected by a complex web of stone passages. And just like the houses, these passages were buried deep inside that massive mound of midden and clay. They were covered streets. Think of it like an ant farm. Or a rabbit warren. To get from your house to your neighbor's house, you stepped out of your room and into a low, narrow tunnel. And I mean low. If you are over 5 feet tall, Skara Brae would be a little bit of a challenge for you. The ceilings of these passages were barely 4 feet high in some places, so you aren't striding confidently to work. You are crouching. You are stooping. Or if you are carrying something heavy, you might even be crawling. It forces you to be humble. You can't really storm out of a room in a rage if you have to immediately duck and waddle away. It ruins the dramatic effect. Let's try to imagine the atmosphere in these corridors. It is dark. Remember, there are no windows here. We are underground. The only light comes from the open doors of the houses, spilling out into the tunnel. So as you move through the village, you are moving through pools of light and shadow. You pass house 7, and you get a warm orange glow from their fire. Then you walk 5 steps into the dark, until you hit the glow from house 5. It must have been incredibly intimate. In our modern world, we value privacy above almost everything else. We build high fences. We put locks on our doors. We put hedges between us and the neighbors so we don't have to make eye contact when we take the trash out. But in Skara Brae, privacy was, well, let's just say it was optional. Living in these tunnels meant you were constantly connected to everyone else. The village wasn't a collection of separate families. It was one big, sprawling organism. Imagine the sound. This is the part one really want you to hear in your head. Stone is hard. It reflects sound. If someone dropped a pot in house 3, the crash would echo down the passage. Plang, plang, plang. If a baby was crying in house 8, everyone knew about it. If a couple was arguing in house 1, well, the whole village probably knew who was winning the argument. But instead of being annoying, I think this might have been comforting. Think about the winter nights. The wind is howling outside, dark and scary. But inside the tunnels, you can hear the hum of life. You can hear your neighbors singing. You can hear the crackle of fires. You can hear footsteps. Let's talk about those footsteps. Because the tunnels were paved with stone, every movement had a sound. Scuff, scuff, scuff. You would learn to recognize people by the sound of their walk. Oh, that heavy stomp. That's Uncle Nolt coming back from the workshop. That light, quick patter. That's the kids chasing each other. It was a world of sound. A world where you were never truly alone. This physical connection must have created a very tight social bond. You couldn't ignore your neighbors. You literally had to crawl past their front door to get anywhere. If you were cooking fish, everyone smelled it. Hey, smells like salmon tonight. Can I come over? If you were sick, everyone knew. It was a society with no secrets. Some people might find that terrifying. The idea of everyone knowing your business 24/7 sounds like a nightmare for introverts. But in a harsh environment like Orkney, this closeness was a survival tool. It meant nobody slipped through the cracks. If an old person didn't light their fire one morning, the neighbors would notice immediately because the tunnel would be darker. They would go in and check. If a mother needed help with a baby, there was always someone just a crawl away. The tunnels turned the village into a fortress of friendship, and the construction of these passages is just as impressive as the houses. They were built with flat stone slabs, just like the furniture. The walls were smooth. The roof was made of slabs laid across the top and then buried. But they weren't just simple tubes. They had little side alcoves. In the walls of the tunnels, you can sometimes find small recesses. What were these for? Maybe they were storage cupboards for overflow stuff. Honey, the dresser is full. Put the extra dried meat in the hallway. Or maybe, and this is a sweeter idea, they were for dogs. We know they had dogs. Big, wolf-like dogs. Maybe these little nooks in the tunnels were where the dogs slept, guarding the entrance to the homes. Imagine walking down the dark tunnel and hearing the soft thump-thump of a tail wagging against the stone as a dog recognizes you. The tunnels also had a defensive use. At the entrance to some of the houses, there are stone bar holes. These are slots cut into the doorframe. They suggest that the residents could put a stone slab across the door and then slide a wooden or bone bar across it to lock it from the inside. So even though they were a close community, they still liked to lock the door at night. Maybe it wasn't to keep their neighbors out. Maybe it was to keep the ghosts out. Or maybe it was just to stop the dogs from wandering in and eating the dinner. Walking through these tunnels today, even without the roof, you get a sense of the scale. It feels small. It feels tight. But it doesn't feel like a prison. It feels like a burrow. It triggers that primal part of your brain that wants to hide under a blanket. It feels protected. The wind can't get you here. The rain can't get you here. The wolves can't get you here. You are deep in the belly of the village. And as you crawl through these dark arteries of Skara Brae, you eventually come to the heart of the home. The thing that kept the darkness away. The thing that made life possible in this stone world. The fire. In the next chapter, we're going to warm our hands. We're going to look at the hearth, the spiritual and physical center of Neolithic life. We're going to smell the peat smoke. And we're going to see how a simple flame was the difference between life and death. So keep crawling. We're almost there. Welcome back to the warmth. We have crawled through the tunnels. We have seen the stone beds. We have seen the dressers. But now we need to look at the most important thing in the room. If you walk into a modern house, the center of the room is usually an empty space. Maybe a coffee table. We push our furniture to the walls so we can walk around. But in Skara Brae, the center of the room belonged to one thing, and one thing only: the fire. In every single house, right in the middle of the floor, there is a square box made of 4 stone slabs standing on their edges. This is the hearth. This is the heart. Without this stone box, life in Orkney would be impossible. It would be dark, it would be freezing, and you would be eating raw shellfish forever. So let's sit down by the fire. I want you to imagine the smell. It's not the smell of burning wood. Remember, there are no trees here. You can't just go out and chop down an oak tree for firewood. Driftwood is rare and precious. You use that for making tools, not for burning. So, what did they burn? They burned the ground itself. They burned peat. If you have never smelled a peat fire, it is a very distinct scent. It is heavy. It is rich. It smells like earth and ancient grass. It hangs in the air. It's the smell of a good Scotch whiskey. Peat is basically soil that is halfway to becoming coal. You dig it out of the ground in wet, heavy slabs. You dry it in the wind. And when you put it in the hearth, it doesn't flame up bright and fast like pine wood. It smolders. It glows deep red. It gives off a slow, steady, intense heat. Now look up. Above the fire, there was no chimney. Chimneys hadn't been invented yet. Instead, there was just a hole in the roof. A simple gap in the skins or turf that covered the house. The smoke would drift up lazily. Some of it would go out the hole. But a lot of it would stay inside. The air in these houses would have been hazy. A constant blue fog hanging near the ceiling. To us, that sounds annoying. Ugh, it's smoky in here. But to them, that smoke was useful. Smoke keeps the flies away. Smoke preserves the meat hanging from the rafters. Smoke makes the roof waterproof by coating the skins in tar. And honestly, after a while, you probably stop noticing it. It just becomes the smell of home. Now, let's talk about the light. This is the part that is hard for us to understand because we live in a world that is never dark. We have LEDs. We have street lights. We have glowing phone screens. But in 3000 BC, when the sun went down, the world disappeared. In the winter in Orkney, the sun goes down at 3:30 in the afternoon. It doesn't come back up until 9 o'clock the next morning. That is almost 18 hours of darkness, every single day. For those 18 hours, the hearth was the only light in the universe. The fire wasn't just a heater. It was the sun. Imagine sitting there. The fire is the only thing you can see clearly. The corners of the room are lost in shadow. The stone dresser is just a vague shape in the gloom. This makes the fire hypnotic. You know how when you go camping, everyone just stares at the fire? Nobody looks at their hands. Nobody looks at the trees. You just stare at the flames. It is Neolithic television. The flames dance. They flicker. They create moving shadows on the stone walls. Maybe that is where their stories came from. You see a shadow on the wall that looks like a bear, or a storm, or a god, and you start to tell a story about it. See that shadow, little one? That is the great wolf that ate the moon. The fire was the center of their culture. It was where they cooked. It was where they worked. If you wanted to fix your fishing net, you had to sit by the fire. If you wanted to carve a bead, you had to sit by the fire. This forced everyone to be together. You couldn't go to your room and sulk. You had to be in the circle of light. It created a literal inner circle. If you were family, you were by the fire. If you were a stranger, you were out in the cold dark. And let's talk about the bedtime angle. The sleep. Sleeping in a room with a peat fire is a very specific experience. The fire makes a sound. It's not a loud crackle. It's a soft hiss and pop. It's a breathing sound. As you lay in your box bed, wrapped in your furs, you would watch the red glow reflect off the ceiling. The stones of the hearth would absorb the heat all day long, and then, at night, they would radiate it back out. So even when the flames died down to just embers, the rocks themselves stayed hot. The whole room stayed warm. It was a thermal battery. I like to think about the job of keeping the fire alive. There are no matches. If the fire goes out, you are in big trouble. You have to try and start it again with friction, or go crawl through the tunnels to beg a burning coal from your neighbor. Hey, sorry to bother you. My fire died again. Seriously, Dave? That's the third time this week. So, someone had to be the keeper of the flame. Maybe it was the grandmother. Maybe it was the last person to go to sleep. They would bank the fire. They would cover the embers with ash to keep them smoldering slowly all night, so that in the morning, they could just blow on it and whoosh, fire again. It was a rhythm. Wake up, blow the fire. Sleep, bank the fire. This cycle went on for 600 years. Think about that. For 6 centuries, fires burned in these same spots. The ash piled up. The stones cracked from the heat. Generations of people were born, grew up, and died by the light of that same hearth. The fire was the constant. It was also their stove. We found pottery near the hearths that still had burnt food stuck to the inside. So we know they were boiling things. Stews, soups. Imagine a big clay pot bubbling away on the hot stones. The smell of seafood stew mixing with the peat smoke. The hearth was the kitchen, the TV, the heater, and the light bulb all in one. But there is one more thing about the fire. It held the fear at bay. The Neolithic world was scary. There were storms. There was total darkness. There were things in the night that you couldn't see. The fire created a boundary. Inside the light, you were safe. Outside the light, you were vulnerable. When you sit by a fire today, you feel that same ancient instinct. You feel your shoulders relax. You feel your eyelids get heavy. It is a genetic memory. We are programmed to love the fire because for thousands of years, the fire was the only thing keeping us alive. So when you look at the cold, empty stone box in the middle of Skara Brae today, don't see it as a ruin. Close your eyes and light the fire in your mind. Put the peat in. Watch the smoke drift up. Feel the heat on your face. Now the house isn't cold stone anymore. It is alive. And now that we are warm and well-fed, we need to talk about what they were actually eating. Because you can't live on fire alone. They were master fishermen. They were farmers. They had a diet that was actually pretty good, maybe even healthier than ours. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the menu. We are going to check out the limpet tanks. We are going to crack open some oysters. And we're going to see what was for dinner in 3000 BC. So, save your appetite. Welcome back to the dinner table. So, we are warm. We have a roof over our heads. We have a nice fire going. Now, there is only one question left on everyone's mind. What's for dinner? When we think of people living 5,000 years ago, we often have this cartoon image in our heads. We imagine a hairy guy gnawing on a raw bone, looking hungry and desperate. We imagine them chasing a mammoth off a cliff and then starving for a month when they miss. But that is not Skara Brae. The people here weren't just surviving. They were thriving. In fact, if you sat down for dinner with them, you might be surprised by how good the menu was. They were eating better than a lot of people in medieval London thousands of years later. They had the ultimate combination. They were farmers, and they were fishermen. They had the surf and turf lifestyle. Let's look at the turf first. Even though Skara Brae looks wild and grassy today, back then, these people were skilled farmers. They raised cattle, they raised sheep, and they probably raised pigs. So they had beef, they had lamb, they had pork chops, and because they had cattle and sheep, they probably had milk. And if you have milk and you leave it alone for a while, you get cheese. Imagine a nice chunk of Neolithic cheddar to go with your steak. They also grew crops. We found pollen from barley. Barley is a tough grain. It can handle the wind. They would grind it down on stone querns to make flour. So they had bread, or maybe a flatbread like a heavy tortilla, or maybe a thick, warm porridge to stick to your ribs on a cold morning. Now let's look at the serve. The ocean was their supermarket. And unlike our supermarkets, everything was free, fresh, and organic. They ate cod, they ate scythe, they ate crab, and they ate mountains of shellfish. When archaeologists dug through the trash piles, the middens, they found millions of shells, oysters, winkles, cockles. This wasn't starvation food. This was high-protein, high-energy fuel. But this brings us to one of the coolest pieces of technology in the house, the limpet tanks. I mentioned these briefly before, but we need to look closer. In the floor of almost every house, built into the stone, there is a square box. It looks like a small bathtub. When they found these, the archaeologists were confused. A stone box isn't watertight. If you pour water into a pile of rocks, it just leaks away. But the people of Skara Brae were clever. They lined the inside of these boxes with raw clay. They smeared the clay into the cracks to seal them. This made the box watertight. It was a stone aquarium. But what was it for? The boxes were found full of limpet shells. Now, limpets are those little cone-shaped shells you see stuck to rocks at the beach. If you have ever tried to eat a limpet, you know a secret. They are terrible. They are tough. They are rubbery. It's like chewing on a pencil eraser. So, why do they have thousands of them in a tank in the living room? There are two theories. Theory 1, they were soaking them. If you soak a limpet in fresh water for a few days, it gets softer. It becomes edible. So maybe the tank was a slow cooker prep station. Theory 2, bait. Limpets smell strong. Fish love them. The people of Skara Brae might have been keeping the limpets alive in the tank to use as fresh bait for catching the real dinner, the big cod and salmon out in the bay. It shows that they were planning ahead. They weren't just running out and hoping to find food. They had a system. They had storage. So let's immerse ourselves. Let's go to a dinner party in house number 1. It is 6 p.m. on a Tuesday in 3000 BC. The wind is howling outside as usual. But inside, it is toasty warm. The fire is blazing. You are sitting on a fur rug with your back against a stone dresser. Your family is there. The neighbors from House 7 have crawled over because they brought some extra venison. Maybe they traded a deer leg for some of your fish. The air smells incredible. It smells of roasted meat, fat dripping onto the hot stones of the hearth. Sizzle. Pop. There is a big clay pot sitting in the ashes, bubbling with a barley stew. It's thick, creamy, and full of herbs they gathered from the hills. Thyme maybe. Sorrel? You have a stone cup in your hand. Maybe it's filled with water. Or maybe, just maybe, they had figured out that if you leave barley water alone for long enough, it it turns into beer. It's a low-alcohol, thick, cloudy beer. But after a hard day of stacking rocks, it tastes amazing. The sound in the room is happy. This isn't a silent, grim meal. People are talking. They are laughing. Did you see the size of the wave that hit the headland today? Did you hear that Una is having another baby? Pass the salt. And yes, they definitely had salt. They live by the sea. They probably dried seawater to get salt to preserve their meat for the winter. You can hear the crunch of breaking crab claws. You can hear the slurp of oysters being eaten raw. There is a communal feeling. Everyone dips their bread into the same pot. The dogs are there too. Big, shaggy dogs lying near the fire, waiting for a bone to be thrown their way. It is a scene of abundance. This is what I love about Skara Brae. It destroys the idea that ancient life was miserable. These people had warm homes, comfortable beds, cool furniture, and a diet that would cost you $100 at a fancy seafood restaurant today. They had security. When you have a tank full of bait and a roof full of smoked meat, you don't have to worry about tomorrow. You can relax. You can make art. You can tell stories. And you can make things. Because they weren't just spending 24 hours a day looking for food, they had free time. And when humans have free time, we start to get creative. We don't just want a spoon. We want a nice spoon. We don't just want a wall. We want a decorated wall. So now that we have eaten, let's look at what they made with their hands. They were artisans. They made jewelry. They made tools. And they made some mysterious stone objects that are still confusing scientists today. In the next chapter, we are going to open the jewelry box. We are going to look at the artisans of the edge. So wipe the barley stew off your chin. Welcome back to the workshop. We have filled our bellies with stew. We have warmed our toes by the fire. The storm is still blowing outside, but we don't care. We have nowhere to be. So what do you do when you have a full stomach, a warm house, and 5 hours before bedtime? You don't just stare at the wall. You make things. This is the part of Skara Brae that really destroys the primitive stereotype. When we hear Stone Age, we usually think of crude, rough things. We think of a big, ugly rock tied to a stick. We think of people who are just barely smart enough to not hit their own thumbs with a hammer. But the people of Skara Brae were not savages. They were artisans. They were craftsmen. And honestly, they were probably more patient than you or I will ever be. They lived in a world without metal. No copper, no bronze, no iron. If you wanted to cut something, you couldn't just grab a knife. If you wanted to sew something, you couldn't just buy a needle. You had to make it. And you had to make it out of the only materials you had, stone and bone. Let's look at the bone first. When they finished eating that leg of lamb or that roasted pig, they didn't throw the bones away. To them, a bone was a raw material. It was plastic before plastic existed. They would take a splinter of bone and grind it down. They would rub it against a rough sandstone block. Scrape, scrape, scrape. They would do this for hours. Slowly, the bone would get thinner. It would get sharper. Eventually, they would create a needle. We found these needles in the ruins. They are delicate. They are smooth. They have tiny eyes drilled into them for the thread. Just think about that for a second. Without a metal drill, how do you make a tiny hole in a piece of bone? You have to use a tiny, sharp flint. You have to twist it back and forth, gently, for a long time. If you push too hard, the bone snaps, and you have to start all over again. These needles tell us something huge. They tell us that the people of Skara Brae weren't just wrapping themselves in raw, bloody animal skins like a cartoon caveman. They were sewing. They were tailoring. They were making clothes that fit. They were stitching leather pieces together to make waterproof coats. They might have even been doing embroidery. They cared about how they looked. And we know they cared about how they looked because of the jewelry. We found beads. Lots of beads. They made necklaces out of tusks, probably from boars or maybe even walrus ivory that washed up on the beach. They made pendants out of teeth. They made beads out of bone. Imagine sitting by the fire, drilling a hole through a wolf's tooth to wear around her neck. It's a statement. It says, I am strong. I am part of this pack. It shows vanity. And I love that. It makes them feel like us. They wanted to show off. They wanted to feel pretty or tough or cool. Then there was the pottery. If you walked into house number 1, the first thing you would see on that stone dresser is the grooved ware. This is the famous style of pottery from this time. It wasn't just a lumpy mud ball. These were flat-bottomed pots, designed to sit on the flat stone shelves, and they were decorated. Before the clay dried, the potter would take a sharp stick or a bone tool and drag it through the surface. They would create lines, geometric patterns, zigzags, and grooves. Why? A plain pot holds water just as well as a decorated one. The decoration adds zero survival value. It doesn't help you eat. It doesn't keep you warm. They did it because they liked it. They did it because they had an aesthetic. They wanted their home to look nice. But the true mastery of Skara Brae wasn't in the clay. It was in the stone. And this brings us to the biggest mystery of the entire village. The object that keeps archaeologists awake at night. The carved stone balls. This is my favorite part of the story. In Skara Brae and across other sites in Scotland, we have found these strange stone spheres. They are about the size of a baseball or a tennis ball. They are made of hard rock, but they aren't just round rocks. They are carved with incredible mathematical precision. Some of them have 6 knobs sticking out, like a geometric flower. Some of them have spirals carved into every surface. Some of them are covered in tiny pyramids. They are perfect. If you hold one in your hand, it feels heavy and balanced. But here is the question, what on earth are they? We have absolutely no idea. Usually, in history, we can guess. If it's sharp, it's a weapon. If it's hollow, it's a cup. But these balls, they don't have a hole to hang them on a string. They aren't battered or chipped, so they probably weren't used to bash people's heads in. They don't have a flat bottom, so they don't sit on a table. They just exist. Think about the skill required to make one. You start with a hard rock. You don't have a metal chisel. You don't have a laser cutter. You have another rock. You have to peck at it. Tap, tap, tap. Millions of times. You have to chip away the stone to leave the knob sticking out. And you have to do it perfectly symmetrically. If you chip off too much on the left side, the ball is ruined. It won't be round anymore. It would take hundreds of hours to make just one of these. So why do it? There are many theories. Some say they were symbols of power, like a scepter. Maybe the chief held a ball during meetings to show he was the boss. I have the ball, so I'm talking. Some say they were weapons, part of a flail or a sling. But like I said, they aren't damaged. If you throw a masterpiece rock at someone's head, it's going to get scratched. These look pristine. Some say they were tools for working leather used to smooth out the skins. But my favorite theory is the bedtime theory. Imagine it's the middle of winter. It's dark. You are stuck inside with your family for the 3rd month in a row. You are bored. You are anxious. You pick up a rock. You start grinding it. It gives your hands something to do. It calms your mind. Maybe they were just art. Maybe they were the Neolithic equivalent of a fidget spinner. A stress ball made of stone. There is something hypnotic about a perfect sphere. Humans love circles. We love symmetry. Maybe the artisan made it just to prove he could. Look at this. I made order out of chaos. When you look at photos of these balls, look at the spirals carved into them. The spiral is a huge symbol in Neolithic art. It represents growth. It represents the seasons, the sun going round, life and death. It's a pattern that never ends. Holding one of these balls would feel cold, then warm as it absorbed your heat. It would be smooth. It would be comforting. So these people weren't just surviving the cold. They were thinkers. They were mathematicians of stone. They were creating beauty in a place that tried very hard to be ugly. They had a rich inner life. And speaking of that inner life, we have to look at their connection to the universe. They didn't just look down at their hands. They looked up. They tracked the sun. They tracked the moon. They knew exactly what time of year it was because in Orkney, if you missed the seasons, you died. In the next chapter, we are going to step outside the house. We are going to look at the sky. We are going to talk about the winter solstice, the most terrifying and important day of the year. The day the sun almost dies. So put down your carving tools. Welcome back to the longest night. We have explored the village. We have eaten the food. We have admired the carved stone balls. But to really understand the people of Skara Brae, you have to understand the darkness. If you live in a city, you don't really know what darkness is. You have streetlights. You have car headlights. You have the glow of the 24-hour convenience store down the street. The night is just a slightly darker version of the day. But in Orkney in 3000 BC, darkness was a physical weight. In the middle of winter, the sun is basically on vacation. It shows up around 9:30 in the morning, hangs around low in the sky looking tired, and then clocks out by 3:30 in the afternoon. That leaves you with 18 hours of night. 18 hours of pitch black, freezing cold, windy emptiness. It is enough to make anyone go a little bit crazy. So the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was the most important day of their lives. Imagine the fear. You are an ancient person. You don't know about orbital mechanics. You don't know that the Earth is tilted on its axis. All you know is that every day, the sun gets lower. Every day, the light gets weaker. The shadows get longer. The cold gets sharper. There is a terrifying thought in the back of your mind. What if it doesn't come back? What if the sun just keeps sinking until it disappears forever? What if the world stays dark? So you watch the sky. You track the seasons with obsessive precision. We know the people of Orkney were master astronomers. Just a few miles away from Skara Brae, there is a giant mound called Maesho. It looks like a big grassy hill, but inside, it is a cathedral of stone. It's a massive tomb, and the engineering is mind-blowing. The entrance passage is a long stone tunnel. It is aligned perfectly, and I mean perfectly, with the setting sun on the winter solstice. On that one special day of the year, as the sun dies on the horizon, a beam of golden light shoots down the tunnel. It hits the back wall of the tomb. For 20 minutes, the dark chamber is filled with light. It is a message. It says, the sun has returned. The cycle is restarting. We are going to survive. The people of Skara Brae knew this. They were the same culture that built Maesho. They understood the movement of the stars. So when the solstice arrived in Skara Brae, the mood in the village must have shifted. The storms might still be raging outside. The waves might be crashing over the dunes. But inside the houses, the fires would be burning a little brighter. This brings us to the most beautiful part of their lives, the storytelling. What you do when you are stuck inside a small stone room with your family for 18 hours of darkness. You can't sleep the whole time. You can't carve stone balls forever. You talk. Skara Brae was a factory of stories. I want you to imagine this scene. It is the depth of winter. The wind is howling so loud it sounds like a pack of wolves trying to dig through the roof. The family is huddled together in the central hearth. The grandparents are there. The parents. The kids. The dogs. The fire is the only light in the universe. It flickers on the faces of the listeners, and someone starts to speak. Long ago, before the stones were raised, this is how their history survived. They didn't write books. They didn't have hard drives. Their library was in their heads. The old people were the hard drives. They held the knowledge of where the best fish were, how to deliver a baby, and how to build a house that doesn't fall down. But they also held the myths. They probably told scary stories. Humans love to be scared when they are safe. They might have told stories about what lives in the dark water of the North Sea. Stories about the Selkies, the seal people who take off their skins to become human. That is a very old Orkney legend. It probably started right there, by a fire just like this one. They might have told stories about the giants who threw the rocks to make the islands. Think about the children. Sitting on the heather mattress, eyes wide, listening to the elder's voice mixing with the sound of the wind. The darkness outside made the story feel real. If the story was about a monster in the night, the monster felt close. But the story was also a shield. As long as the voice kept talking, the darkness couldn't get in. As long as the story continued, the tribe continued. This is a meta moment for us. Because right now, thousands of years later, we are doing the exact same thing. I am a voice in the dark. You are listening. We are telling a story about them telling a story. We haven't changed that much. We still use stories to make sense of the cold. We still use stories to help us sleep. The layout of Skara Brae encouraged this. The houses were clustered together. The tunnels connected them. I like to imagine that on the solstice, the whole village might have gathered in the biggest house, maybe house 1. Imagine 50 people packed into that room. Body heat raising the temperature. The smell of sweat and smoke and feast food. They would feast because if the sun is coming back, you don't need to ration the food as strictly. You can celebrate. They probably sang. Stone walls have amazing acoustics. If you hum a low note in a stone room, it resonates. It vibrates in your chest. Imagine a group of men and women chanting or singing low rhythmic songs while the storm raged outside. The sound would drift down the tunnels. It would make the whole mound hum. It was a defiance. They were saying to the winter, "You can scream all you want. We are here. We are warm. And we are together." The winter solstice was the turning point. After that night, the days would get a tiny bit longer. The light would slowly creep back. The grass would grow again. The cattle would get fat. The darkness would retreat. But not everyone fit into this happy, communal picture. As we look closer at the village, we find something odd. Most of the houses are exactly the same. Same bed on the right. Same bed on the left. Same dresser in the middle. But there is one house that breaks the rules. It is called House 8. It stands apart from the main cluster. It doesn't look like a home. It doesn't have the normal furniture. Was it a workshop? Was it a temple? Or was it something darker? Was it a place for the people who didn't fit in? In the next chapter, we are going to leave the warmth of the family fire. We are going to go to the edge of the village. We are going to investigate the mystery of House 8. So finish your story. Put another piece of peat on the fire. Welcome back to the shadows. We have spent the last 12 chapters painting a pretty nice picture of Skara Brae. We've talked about the warm fires, the cozy beds, the seafood dinners, the friendly neighbors crawling through the tunnels to share stories. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? It sounds like a Neolithic utopia. A place where everyone got along, lived in harmony with nature, and sang songs while carving stone balls. It's tempting to look at the past through rose-colored glasses. We like to think that before money, and before the internet, and before traffic jams, life was simple and pure. We like to think that humans were better back then. But I am here to burst that bubble. Because humans are humans. And whether we are wearing a suit and tie in a skyscraper, or a fur tunic in a stone hut, we are exactly the same animal. We get jealous. We get angry. We get greedy. And sometimes we do bad things. Skara Brae wasn't just a happy commune. It was a real place filled with real people. And real people have secrets. Let's look at the evidence. Remember house number 7? It's one of the best preserved houses in the village. It has the beds, the dresser, the whole package. But when archaeologists were excavating house 7, they found something that wasn't on the floor plan. They weren't looking for it. They were just checking the foundations, looking at how the walls were built. And there, buried directly underneath the stone wall of the house, was a stone box. Grave? Now this is weird. Usually, in Neolithic Orkney, people didn't bury their dead inside the village. They had special places for that, huge impressive tombs like Maeshowe or Quanternis. The dead lived over there, and the living lived here. You didn't mix them. But in this box, under the floor, they found 2 skeletons. They were 2 women. And they were old, well, old for the time, likely in their 50s. Why were they there? This is the part that gets a little dark. There is a theory called foundation sacrifice. In many ancient cultures, all over the world, there was a belief that a building needs a soul to make it strong, to keep the walls standing, to protect the house from evil spirits. So when you build a new house, you would put something precious in the foundation. Sometimes it was a pot of grain. Sometimes it was an animal. And sometimes it was a person. Were these 2 women sacrificed to make House 7 lucky? Were they killed so their spirits would hold up the roof? It is a terrifying thought. Imagine the scene. The village gathering. The digging of the hole. The silence as the wall was built over the top. It suggests a belief system that was much scarier than just worshipping the sun. It suggests fear. But let's not jump straight to murder. There is a kinder theory. Maybe these women were the matriarchs, the grandmothers, the leaders of the family. Maybe the family loved them so much that they couldn't bear to put them in the cold, distant tomb on the hill. Maybe they wanted grandma to stay close. We will build a house on top of her. She will support us literally and spiritually. So, is it a crime scene? Or is it an act of deep love? We don't know. But the fact that they were buried under the wall implies they were put there before the house was finished. They are part of the architecture. It reminds us that death was right there. It was under the floorboards. And life for the living wasn't exactly a walk in the park either. When we look at skeletons from this time period in Orkney, we see the scars of a hard life. We see skulls with dents in them. Now, maybe that's from a rock falling on your head. Accident happened. But maybe it's from a fight. Imagine living in Skara Brae in the winter. You are stuck inside. You can't leave. You are living in a small room with your parents, your kids, and your in-laws. For months. Cabin fever is real. You can imagine the tension. The arguments. You ate the last oyster. You let the fire go out. You're snoring too loud. In a world without police, without judges, and without divorce lawyers, how do they solve problems? Did they talk it out? Or did they pick up a heavy stone ball and settle it the hard way? We assumed they were peaceful, but violence is a part of human nature. And then there was the physical pain. We have found skeletons with terrible arthritis. Their backs were bent. Their knees were worn out. Why? Because they worked constantly. Think about the women grinding grain. They spent hours every day kneeling on the stone floor, rubbing a heavy rock against another rock to make flour. That destroys your joints. It destroys your toes. We also see terrible teeth. The flour was full of grit from the sandstone grinder. So every time they ate bread, they were basically chewing on sandpaper. By the time they were 30, their teeth were worn down to stumps. Constant toothache, constant back pain, darkness. Oh, it takes a toll on your mind. So when we imagine them telling stories by the fire, maybe they weren't always telling happy stories. Maybe they were venting. Maybe they were crying. There is also the question of hierarchy. Remember the jewelry, the beads, and the pendants? Not everyone had them. Some people had lots of nice things. Some people had nothing. This tells us that there was inequality. There were haves and have-nots. And where there is inequality, there is jealousy. Did the family in House 1 look down on the family in House 5? Did they gossip? Look at them. They don't even have a groove to wear pot on their dresser. Disgusting. It sounds petty, but that is the human condition. We compare ourselves to others. We form cliques. We exclude people. Maybe that is what House 8 was about. Maybe it was for the outcasts, the people who didn't fit the social group. So Skara Brae wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gritty, tough, complicated place. It was a place where you buried your grandmother under the floor. It was a place where your teeth hurt. It was a place where you might get hit in the head if you annoyed the wrong person. But I think acknowledging this darkness makes them more interesting. If they were just perfect, happy angels, they would be boring. But knowing that they struggled, that they fought, that they feared the dark, and that they buried their secrets under the walls, that makes them real. It makes them just like us, but with harder lives. They survived for 600 years. That is a long time. The United States has only been around for a fraction of that time. But eventually, the luck ran out. The fire went out. The arguments stopped. The pain stopped. Something happened that ended the story of Skara Brae. Was it a war? Was it a plague? Or was it simply the sand, patiently waiting to take back what belonged to it? In the next chapter, we are going to watch the village die. We are going to witness the great abandonment. We are going to see how the lights finally went out in the stone city. So prepare yourself for the end. Welcome to the end of the line. We have watched this village grow. We have watched it thrive. We have sat by its fires for 13 chapters. But the sad truth of history is that nothing lasts forever. Every empire falls. Every city crumbles. And eventually, every fire goes out. Skara Brae had a good run. A really good run. People lived in these houses for about 600 years. That is roughly 25 generations. That is longer than the Roman Empire lasted in Britain. But around the year 2500 BC, the story stops. The people left, and they never came back. So the million-dollar question is, why? Why would you leave a place that has warm beds, fresh seafood, and walls that are built like a tank? We already debunked the sudden disaster theory. We know a volcano didn't blow them up. We know an army didn't wipe them out. The truth is much slower and honestly much sadder. It was a breakup. A breakup between the people and the land. The first problem was the sand. I have mentioned the sand a lot, but by 2500 BC, it wasn't just a nuisance. It was a monster. The climate was changing. The world was getting colder and stormier. The protective dunes that sheltered the village were eroding. The sea was getting closer. Imagine waking up every single morning, having to shovel a foot of sand out of your doorway. Imagine eating dinner and feeling grit in your teeth every single night. Imagine the salt spray killing your crops in the fields. It grinds you down. It stops being home and starts being a battle. But there was something else happening too. Something in their heads. Society was changing. Across Britain, people were stopping the village life. They were moving away from these tight, huddled communities. They were starting to build big, open monuments. The age of the stone circles was beginning. The Ring of Roger was being built nearby. It seems like the young people wanted something new. This is the brain drain theory. Imagine you are a 20-year-old in Skara Brae. You look at your grandfather. He is bent over. His teeth are worn down. He spends his whole life hiding in a hole in the ground, eating limpets. And then you hear stories about the mainland, or even just the other side of the island. People there are doing new things. They are meeting in big groups under the sky. They are trading new ideas. You look at your dark, smoky stone hut, and you think, I'm out of here. So the Great Abandonment wasn't a mass evacuation. It was a slow drip. One family decides to leave. We're moving inland, they say. The soil is better there. Less salt. They pack their furs. They take their best pots. They take the beads made of whale teeth. They walk out of the tunnel. They don't look back. And then the village feels a little quieter. A few years later, another family leaves. It's too lonely here, they say. Everyone is going to the Roger meeting place. Slowly, the noise dies down. The tunnels, which used to echo with the sound of children playing and dogs barking, start to go silent. House number 3 goes dark. Then house number 5. Eventually, you are left with just the old diehards. The people who refuse to change. I was born in this midden, and I'm staying in this midden, but time wins in the end. The old people pass away, or they get too frail to maintain the houses, and their children come back to drag them away to the new settlements. I want you to imagine the very last night. There must have been a last person. Maybe it was a stubborn old fisherman. Or maybe it was a young woman who stayed until the very end to close things up. Picture them standing in house number 1. The room is empty. The furs are gone from the beds. The pots are gone from the dresser. The limpet tanks are dry. It's just stone. The fire is dying in the hearth. Just a few red embers glowing in the ash. The person looks around. They remember the parties. They remember the stories told on the winter solstice. They remember the smell of the stew. But now all they hear is the wind. They don't destroy the house. They don't smash the dresser. They leave it exactly as it is. They step out of the door. And here is the detail that breaks my heart. We found evidence that in some houses, the doors were blocked up from the outside. They didn't just walk away. They closed the door. They sealed it. It was an act of respect, like closing the eyes of the dead. They walked out of the tunnel, placed a stone slab over the entrance, and walked away into the dunes. And then the silence took over. Real silence. For the first time in 600 years, no smoke rose from the mount. No dogs barked. No babies cried. The sand didn't wait. The wind blew. The sand drifted against the stone walls. It piled up against the sealed doors. Winter after winter, the layers grew. First, the tunnels were buried. Then the roofs. The grass started to grow over the fresh sand. Within a few generations, Skara Brae wasn't a village anymore. It was just a bump in the landscape. The people who lived nearby probably forgot it was even there. Or maybe it became a legend. Don't go near that hill, son. The old ones sleep there. And then even the legend faded. It became just a hill. Sheep grazed on top of it. Vikings arrived thousands of years later and walked right over the top of it, having no idea that an entire city was sleeping 10 feet beneath their boots. It slept for 4,500 years. Think about that time scale. While Skara Brae slept, the pyramids rose and fell. While Skara Brae slept, the Roman Empire conquered the world and collapsed. While Skara Brae slept, Jesus was born. While Skara Brae slept, Columbus sailed to America. While Skara Brae slept, the Industrial Revolution changed the world. It missed everything. It was safe in its cocoon of sand, the perfect preservative. If the people hadn't abandoned it, if they had stayed and kept rebuilding, it would have been destroyed. Modern houses would be built on top of it. The stones would have been robbed to build farm walls. So, in a weird way, the great abandonment saved it. Leaving was the best thing they ever did for us. Because they walked away and locked the door, they preserved their world for us to find. It's a time capsule. And when William Watt's shovel hit that stone in 1850, he wasn't discovering a ruin. He was opening a present that had been wrapped up by the sand for 5 millennia. So, the story of Skara Brae is a tragedy, yes. It is sad to see the lights go out. But it is also a miracle. We know them. We know how they slept. We know what they ate. We know they had back pain and like jewelry. They are not forgotten. And now, as we reach the end of our journey, we have to come back to the present. We have to leave the Stone Age and come back to our warm beds in the modern world. But I want to leave you with one final thought. A thought about what we leave behind. In the next and final chapter, we are going to stand on the edge of the cliff today. We are going to look at the threat facing Skara Brae right now. Because the storm that uncovered it is also trying to destroy it. Let's wrap this up. Welcome back to the present day. We have traveled through time. We have weathered the storm of 1850. We have dug with a laird. We have sat by the Neolithic fire. And we have watched the last family walk away into the dunes. Now we are back in the 21st century. If you go to Orkney today, which you really should, it's beautiful. You can visit Skara Brae. You park your car. You buy a ticket. You walk past a nice little gift shop selling woolly jumpers and magnets. And then you walk out onto the grass. It is a strange feeling. You are looking down into these houses. The roofs are gone, so you can see everything. It looks like a dollhouse that someone took the lid off of. You can see the dressers. You can see the hearths. You can see the beds. But it is quiet. The smoke is gone. The smell of cooking stew is gone. The laughter is gone. All you hear now is the click of cameras and the wind. Always the wind. But as you stand there, looking at these stones that have survived for 5,000 years, you realize something unsettled. The story isn't over. Remember the villain of our story, the North Sea. It is still there, and it is still hungry. Skara Brae is sitting right on the edge of the beach. In fact, it is terrifyingly close to the water. In the 1920s, a seawall was built to protect it. It's a big, ugly concrete barrier designed to stop the waves from eating the village. But nature is patient. Nature has all the time in the world. Climate change is raising the sea levels. The storms are getting stronger again, just like they did in 2500 BC. The water is clawing at the concrete. Archaeologists know the truth. We can't save it forever. One day, maybe in 100 years, maybe in 500, the sea will win. The wall will break. The waves will crash over the dresser in house number 1. The sand will scour away the stone beds. And Skara Brae will be washed into the Atlantic Ocean. It will return to the sand from which it came. Now, that might sound depressing. You might be thinking, why did I watch this whole video just to hear that it's going to be destroyed? But I don't think it's sad. I think it's beautiful. It reminds us of the fragility of everything. We humans love to build things. We build skyscrapers. We build highways. We build internet servers. We like to think that we are permanent. We like to think that our cities will last forever. But the people of Skara Brae thought that too. They built with massive slabs of stone. They thought, this house is solid. It will stand for eternity. And in a way, they were right. It stood for a very, very long time. But nothing is forever. Standing at the railing, looking down at those empty rooms, you get a sense of perspective. Your problems, the email you forgot to send, the embarrassing thing you said at a party 5 years ago, the stress about money, they feel very small when you're looking at 5,000 years of history. The people who lived here had problems too. They worried about the harvest. They worried about their kids. They worried about the wolves. And now, those worries are gone. The people are gone. Only the stone remains. It is a humbling thought. It takes the weight off your shoulders. If the mighty stone dresser of house one can't last forever, then maybe you don't need to worry so much about your messy desk. It brings a sense of peace. And that brings us to the final thought of the night. The bedtime thought. I want you to think about the act of sleeping. Tonight, when this video ends, you're going to close your eyes. You are going to pull the blanket up. You are going to drift off. 5,000 years ago, in that stone box on the right side of the room, a man or a woman did exactly the same thing. They fluffed up the heather. They pulled the sheepskin tight. They listened to the wind. And they closed their eyes. They dreamed. Maybe they dreamed about flying. Maybe they dreamed about catching a giant fish. Maybe they dreamed about the summer sun. We are connected to them by that simple act. Sleep is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if you are a Neolithic hunter or a modern accountant. When we sleep, we are all the same. We are all vulnerable. We are all resting. Skara Brae is a monument to that rest. It is a village of bedrooms. When you look at the ruins, don't see them as cold, dead rocks. See them as a place where people found comfort. The fires may be out, but the warmth of the story remains. They lived. They loved. They fought. They built. And then they slept. And now it is your turn. The wind is outside. The world is turning. The history books are closed. You are safe. You are warm. The sand has covered the past, and the future will take care of itself. For now, just listen to the silence. Good night, Skara Brae, and good night to you.